I'm Geoff Ward, Professor of African and African American Studies at WashU and guest host for this episode of Everywhere with CRE2. This episode spotlights the CRE2-Kemper Curatorial Research Internship, through which Gabriella Senno developed insights into the sociopolitical history and context of the late 19th century founding of the Kemper Art Museum, which began as the St. Louis School and Museum of Fine Arts. Joining me are Sabine Eckmann, who is the William T. Kemper Director and Chief Curator of the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum at Washington University, Meredith Malone, who is Curator at the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, and Gabi, who is graduating this month from Washington University and has just completed a term as the inaugural CRE2-Kemper Curatorial Research Intern. Meredith, before we focus on Gabi's research, for those listeners unfamiliar with research in the context of museums, I'd like to begin by asking you to briefly describe some of the practices and purposes of curatorial research.
Sure, thank you, Geoff. So at the museum, as a curator, I'm also an art historian. So fundamentally, our research is very much in line with general humanities research. Some of the core aspects that we are focusing on are, research on the artworks that make up our permanent collection at the museum, but we also do research to create the special exhibitions that we originate at the museum as well. And I'll just say a few words about, what research on the permanent collection means here. We focus on the art objects that are in the care of the Kemper Art Museum. And the Kemper is a museum that it's a modern contemporary art museum. So the works in the collection span the 19th century through global contemporary. We do research and we publish scholarship on the works in our collection with the aim of interpreting and contextualizing these works, but also the narratives fundamentally that shape our understanding of the past and the present through these artworks. This also includes what's known as provenance research. So provenance is fundamentally it's the history of ownership of a given art object. So a provenance provides documented history that can help prove ownership, assign the work to a known artist, and establish the work of art's authenticity. So there are certainly some interesting ethical considerations that come along with provenance research as well. When you're thinking about when it comes to collecting, this is a central research question for us as well. Maybe I'll just say another word about special exhibition research too. The shows that we originate here at the Kemper range, they might be historical exhibitions, or they might focus on contemporary art. They might focus on one artist or be more of a group exhibition. They often entail archival research, depending on the topic. And many of the exhibitions we undertake aim to inspire social and intellectual inquiry into connections between art and contemporary life. And I think that is really kind of a driving focus behind much of the research that we conduct at the Kemper.
Thank you for that context. And Sabine, as Director and Chief Curator of our University Museum, what are some of the ways you see this research activity Meredith described connecting to the CRE2 mission of advancing research on race and ethnicity? Why is this important to the museum?
Thanks for the question, Geoff. I think what we could say in the broadest sense, it is a focus on what has been excluded from existing histories about the collection and about the institutional history, but also about selected works in our collection. And I'm sure Gabi can speak more to the complications to sort of illuminate connections between the institutional history and the history of racism that is sort of not so easy to basically make these connections and to find the most relevant documents. So I think we are in the very beginning of a very large project in terms of trying to focus on exclusions in order to advance a more inclusive history of art, a more inclusive history of our collection, and also a more inclusive exhibition histories. So we will have to go out of our way as art historians a little bit and look more for really sociopolitical, contextual, archival sources, and make a connection between that kind of history and what is and what is not in our collection. And I do think the other emphasis in the broadest sense is not only this aim to be more inclusive, but also to really reflect on these exclusions. I think that that kind of emphasis is important. So really to always try to balance this connection between the focus on the center and the focus on the periphery, and also ask why and how, in which ways this periphery existed. But I do think connections to CRE2 will also drive some of our exhibitions and also some of our historical exhibitions. We are, for example, planning an exhibition on St. Louis and modern architecture and design in St. Louis. That is a topic which has been published on, and it's a topic which we know some, we know about, but I think it has never been connected really also to a history of segregation in St. Louis, and to a history of where African Americans lived in St. Louis, who built the buildings for them, what was their design agendas, and were these buildings, these housing projects, successful or not successful, and so forth. So I think we are adding to this history people know about, what people don't know about, with a focus specifically here on in St. Louis on the segregation of the city and the African American population, just as one example. And all that seems important to us in this particular moment where the United States, but also globally, we are trying to reckon with a history of exclusions and try to be more democratic in our historical research, but also just in terms of moving society forward in maybe more just ways.
Thank you, Sabina. And now with this context, I want to turn to you, Gabi, and first ask you to describe your interest in participating in this curatorial research internship at the Kemper Art Museum. Can you say a little bit about your hopes or your interests going into this work?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think my biggest goal and my biggest aspiration and hope was just to learn. And I know that's like a very simple answer, but before doing this internship, I had never worked in a museum space before. I knew I was really interested in museum work and just what went on in a museum, but I didn't know what that meant. So I really just wanted to learn. And I was hoping that my previous like research writing skills that I had honed kind of throughout my thesis writing process would help with this curation position. But yeah, I really just wanted to learn and understand like what museums do, what they're like, who works inside them, like what the curation position is like. That was really my central goal, I think, going into all of this.
And Sabina alluded to some of this, but tell us about the kinds of questions you were interested in asking about the Kemper Art Museum's foundation and early history, and maybe say a bit about what your semester of research revealed regarding those questions.
Yeah, so I think the first step I took when I started this project is I really wanted to understand the historical context and basic background information for the foundations of the art school and museum. I feel like when I typically take on a research project or a research idea, that's like where I start, because it makes the most sense logically for me, is to start, what's going on in this time period? When was the art school founded? When was the museum founded? Who started it? And then once I find answers to those kind of basic questions, so like who started it, for example, well, we have like Halsey C. Ives and Wayman Crowe kind of like working together during that early period. So then I want to understand, well, like who is Halsey C. Ives and who is Wayman Crowe? And what are their specific relationships like to the racial landscape and ethnic landscape of St. Louis during that time period, as well as within the university? So I think those smaller, like really basic kind of surface level questions, once I find the answers to those lead me to that kind of the bigger questions of like, why is this work kind of important? As far as things that this research revealed, like Dr. Eckmann said, this is very much in the early process still. So I'm not sure I have like solid conclusions. I think I have more questions than answers still at this point. But the things that I guess are future avenues of research might be Ives's relationship to indigenous artworks. I think that was something that came up that was really fascinating. And, while he seems pretty inclusive on the surface, I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case, considering his colleague Crowe's opinion towards colonialism at the time. So I think that's one thing. Also, another thing is Ives's relationship to women and women's clubs of St. Louis and of the United States, just more broadly. Um, and then the third thing that really stood out to me was Ives's relationship to the working class, because he seems to have come from this like background of like humble beginnings as like a draftsperson in New York, which is where he's from, and then he marries into a wealthy family and becomes part of this like white elite. So I'm wondering where he stands in terms of the working class, because he goes from being on one side of the socioeconomic spectrum to the other pretty rapidly. But yeah, so those are the things that stood out to me, but I think that there's a lot of other things that this research revealed that maybe were smaller in scope.
And what are some of the sources? I mean, you, in a matter of months, you managed to piece together a really rich sort of background story about the St. Louis School and Museum of Fine Arts, which eventually became was the foundation of the Kemper Art Museum. What are some of the sources you use to uncover this story?
I primarily looked at primary sources. So I did a lot of archival research, and that research started in the Olin Library Special Collections on campus here. And that collection houses the College of Art's records, but doesn't really have anything directly related to the museum, independent of the College of Art. And then I also spent a lot of time at the St. Louis Art Museum's Richardson Memorial Library, which houses the Halsey C. Ives papers. And those sources were really helpful, I think, in getting me grounded in the time period and understanding generally what Ives's life was like, because his papers at SLAM, for example, had documents ranging from his writings, drafts of his writings, his correspondence with Chancellor Eliot, and just other prominent people at the university. But it also had like personal documents and personal information, because this collection was donated by a member of his family. And so there was things like restaurant receipts and like housing documents and like scrapbooks and like personal documents from his family life, which I think illustrated maybe more his relationship to the social the social worlds of St. Louis at the time, because there was also a lot of documents about his wife and her involvement in women's clubs. So yeah, those are the sources I used, and I think that that's how it really helped me.
Research projects always present challenges, and I'm sure you encountered many here. Were there any notable challenges or sort of moments where your research took a turn you weren't expecting, maybe because of an obstacle you encountered, or because you realized you were maybe thinking about things, the way you were thinking about things weren't quite aligned with what you were seeing?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think definitely every time I went into the archive, it did not go as it was supposed to go. Because I would go in, I would have a plan. I'm going to look at, XYZ document. I'm going to come out having read some stuff, and I'm going to like have so much more knowledge than I had before. And I think while I still, came out with a lot of knowledge, yeah, just the plan changed. As soon as you get in the archive, the plan changes. And I think part of that is because the nature of these documents, a lot of them are handwritten. So reading Ives's handwriting or reading, another person's handwriting in these papers is very challenging, because the cursive from the time period is like very challenging to read, in my opinion. But sometimes things take longer than you expect. And that was another thing I encountered was, I had this plan to read like 3 or 4 documents, and I would come out reading only one because that one document was like 30 or 40 pages. And that's not something that's listed in the like finding archive of like the collection. So you don't know like how many pages these documents are until you get there and look at them. And so I think, yeah, I think time was my biggest challenge, as well as just the nature of these documents. And I also think sometimes too with research, it's frustrating when you have more questions than answers at a certain point. And I know that's what the beginning of the process looks like, but at times you're just like, oh, I want some answers. Like I've been working on this for so long, and some answers would be great. But that's just something that comes with the territory, and something that as a researcher, I think we all kind of have to accept.
Well, that leads me to my next question, which is, you set up a really great foundation for this work to continue, and I wonder if there are any particular questions unanswered that you feel are especially pressing, or that might be especially worthwhile for, I don't know, a future intern or other researcher to pick up.
Yeah, I think the thing that I think I mentioned this earlier, but the thing that really stood out to me, and I think this is just because of my interest in um, different minority populations of the US, but the thing that really stood out to me was Ives's relationship with Indigenous people and Indigenous artworks, because at the 1904 World's Fair, he exhibited baskets and different woven items by Indigenous people, particularly by Indigenous women. And in a lot of the things that I read, it said his goal was to expand the definition of the fine arts to like the decorative arts or the useful arts, because he believed that, or so it said that he believed that um, anyone who is able to craft something with their hands, and whether the object that results of that craft is useful or meant to be beautiful or meant to have a purpose or just meant to have be something to look at, all of those people should be considered artists, and all of those people should be considered fine artists. But I'm really interested too in, I guess, understanding his definition of the fine arts, and who that included and who that excluded, and to what end did those definitions include and exclude certain people. because, like I said before, he was working very closely with Crow, who had more explicit opinions on Indigenous people. And I'm not sure that what we see directly on the surface is what was actually being thought, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think there definitely needs to be more inquiry into that.
You mentioned that Crow had more explicit opinions about indigenous populations in their creative work. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, so I am gonna be honest and say I did not find this like one specific document that like said Crow said this thing and he said this thing and then he said this thing. It was a lot of, I think, reading between the lines, but there was this one newspaper article that Kim, the registrar at the Kemper, had put into the box folder, and it was from the time Crow had dedicated the museum, or gifted the museum to WashU. And the author of that article was basically repeating the speeches that had been said at the night of the, that gifting, that transfer of the museum to WashU. And according to this author, Crow had said that museums and just generally like the museum was being built on indigenous land, and like the indigenous people were like not bothered by this, and they're like kind of a people of the past is like what he was getting at. And I think that was a pretty widespread idea at the time, was that indigenous people were of the so-called dying race. And so I think that his discussion of the land in which the museum was built on really shows that he was of that same thought period of that time, in which indigenous people were of this dying race and therefore could not have an opinion on the museum's construction. But yeah, there's still more to be said about Crow as well, but I think that at least reporters at the time definitely reflected him more outward in his opinions of colonialism.
Thank you for that. And this is a nice, I think, place to go back to Sabine and Meredith and ask them, though the research is continuing, I wonder what you would sort of say about the value of this investigation into the foundation of the museum. Why is it important now, and more specifically, what can the museum do with these insights? Sabine, you mentioned advancing more inclusive histories and exhibitions. Can you say more about how this work might translate into the kinds of experiences we can have at and really through the museum?
Yes, thank you. And thanks, Gabi, for all your very valuable and insightful research. As I sort of alluded to, we are in a moment of epistemic shift, and we are all focusing on this kind of entanglement of the dominant Western cultures with racism and colonialism. And so basically, Gabi's project, or the project you began, plays, I think, a really important role in the goal of our museum, and I hope of many other museums, to be and to try to offer its publics a really transparent history of its collection and its institutional history. So this is, the bigger framework in which Gabi worked. Um, Beyond that, of in terms of how we envision of how to make this actually palpable as an experience in the museum, I feel strongly that we have to go to a model where we are not only showing artworks in the galleries, but where we mix these artworks with historical documents in order to be able to present a more situated, contextualized history. So you're not only looking at the artwork in order to admire the artwork, but you're also looking to the artwork and at the same time experience the context in which it was made. And that sounds probably pretty easy as a or pretty straightforward as a method art museums should pursue, but the reality is that there's still this kind of really strong notion that an art museum should present artworks by themselves and not mix them up with non-artwork. So that is a big debate. And in the past, I have done exhibitions where we connected artworks with historical documents, and there was a lot of criticism about this method. So even if on maybe a campus museum, a university museum, it seems the easiest way to make these histories that are hidden visible by connecting documents, archival materials with the actual artworks. It is something at the same time which is still controversial within the institution of the art museum. But I strongly believe that this would be a way to bring to the public in the museum and not only through publications and maybe our new website to make this institutional history more visible through these kinds of more historical sociopolitical connections.
I just want to add to that to say I fully agree with everything that Sabina was saying, and that it does. But in addition, I think that this kind of research what the Gabi is doing is also just helping further along the kind of questioning and interrogation of received narratives that lie kind of at the core of some of the earlier work in our collection. Along with bringing in these contextualizing materials, it's also will really push us to think about, what works we have on display. What are the, what don't we have in the collection and why? What kind of juxtapositions are we putting on the walls? How are we writing the didactic material that people are going to be reading? Normally, a lot of that didactic material, again, has focused on, unpacking a given work of art. But again, it's there that we can also give this kind of broader contextualization about, why it was made, what its use was, who was commissioning these things, bringing in these histories that Gabby's been looking at about, not only the work of art, but also the broader connections around, the donors and the relationships and this context in St. Louis itself.
Thank you for that. And I want to ask you now, Gabi, what you've been in the weeds with this work, and I want to also come back to your thesis research in a moment. But as a soon-to-be former student, congratulations on that. But what do you think about the potential to translate some of this work into the museum itself and the way the museum sort of is experienced by other students, by members of the community, faculty and staff? Do you have ideas about how these insights can be translated into a different kind of experience and encounter in the museum?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think it's something that I've definitely reflected on more so in the beginning of my internship, I think. Um, yeah, I think like Sabina, I think that the information and Meredith should be incorporated within the didactics, but I also think maybe it depends on the like organization of the artwork itself. Like um I guess maybe not necessarily being presented chronologically, but maybe thematically by a specific like topic. Like for example, when I visited, I'm just thinking of the what was it called? It's a museum in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I think it's the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts or something of that sort. And they had the artwork um, organized by like theme. Like it was like, here are artworks that were made like very recently because it's like contemporary art, um, like that represent the past. Here's like artworks that represent like the present day, and then it on the other side of the gallery, it was like, here are artworks that represent the future. And I think that that kind of ordering really challenged me to think about um, the different social issues that these artists were trying to get at, and commenting on. And so I think that there should possibly be um, more organization thematically, even though I do know art museums do that. But as far as my experiences within um, just several art museums, including the Kemper, I think a lot of them seem to have been by chronology or by like artistic period, you know. And rather than defining the art by its period, I think we need to define it, like Sabina and Meredith said, by its context and by it's the actors involved in these.
Yes. If I can just add to that, we do have a history of only thematic presentations, as Meredith will also remember, and it's actually with the opening of the new museum, the expanded museum in 2019, for the very first time that we are presenting a chronological history, because we felt after all these thematic inquiries, we felt very strongly to present history again, because what these thematic presentations did, and we had, for example, one on portraiture, there was at times one on the environment and landscape, and it felt like that it became so much about the topic that the actual contextualization of the works from all the way back to the 18th century to the 21st century um, felt not represented in any kind of comprehensive way. So I think maybe we have to really think for the future, and it's a good suggestion, Gabi, of both. You know, maybe we can do both without losing history again, because it always felt that we are losing history by only focusing on themes. And so maybe it should be much more of a combination of both. I think that's actually a good idea, and exciting to think about it, to you know, combine both approaches with each other.
Yeah, and as far as combinations go, I was also thinking a lot about how the museum should be an interdisciplinary space. I think this internship really represents how museums can be interdisciplinary. I mean, for example, like, you know, Geoff, you're a professor of African and African American studies, and, you know, both Meredith and Sabina are art historians, and I'm an American culture studies major. And I think that museums can often be sometimes very much art history centered, or maybe they only bring in a certain, you know, population of people because of that centering. But I think it's really important for students across various departments on campus, um, and like various schools, not just the art school, but like, you know, the medical school or the engineering school, or, you know, whatever school that it is, should come to the museum and should really interact with the pieces through their classes. And I think that's something that the education team at the Kemper has been working on, and I think doing a really like fantastic job at. But it's definitely something, just museums as a whole, we need to see more of.
So I want to switch gears a little bit and ask you to talk to us a bit about share a bit about your amazing thesis research project. And I'm really struck by the two ways you've been examining histories of arts education this year, both in terms of the St. Louis School and Museum of Fine Arts, and in terms of Chura Obata's and his wife Haruko Kohashi's more popular and oppositional arts educational practices. What insights do we gain from thinking about these arts educational histories alongside each other in terms of the scope of American arts education, or the forms it can take, or the stakes? I know this wasn't the focus of your project with the curatorial internship, but it's striking to me that you were looking at these two somewhat juxtaposed approaches to arts education in U.S. history and this question of American art. So I wonder what connections you see between these two projects, and maybe insights that come from thinking about them together.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. But I mean, I guess first I'll start by explaining a little bit what my thesis was about. So my undergraduate thesis in the American Culture Studies department, examines the Sumi-e paintings by Chura Obata during the Japanese incarceration of World War II, specifically the years 1942 to 1943, at Tanforan Assembly Center and Topaz Relocation Center. And those were two incarceration centers during the Japanese, what is called the Japanese internment, more commonly, I suppose. And so what I was really trying to understand in my thesis was how Obata and other Japanese American artists were resisting the visual narrative that was disseminated by the U.S. government at the time. So how were their artworks of the incarceration were countering what was being disseminated throughout the media. As far as arts education goes, I think one of the things that stood out to me was really how American art and arts education had to change over time, and changes based on different social conditions. So really the history of the art school is kind of somewhat a precedent, I think, for the history of the art schools within Tanforan and Topaz, because Ives was very involved in defining fine art before kind of Obata hit the scene in terms of his contributions to American art. And I also think the conditions were very different, right? The art schools at Tanforan and Topaz were under conditions of surveillance. So fine art is obviously going to change under those conditions. And the last thing too, which kind of stood out to me was, yeah, like Ives is defining these fine arts like very broadly, like not just including, our traditional notions of fine art, but attempting to include decorative arts and useful arts and, things of that nature. I think Obata really challenges what fine art is too, because a lot of art historians consider his artwork to be documentation, because incarcerees were not allowed, cameras or, any type of technological device to record their experience. So they turned to artwork. So he kind of includes documentation in this fine art realm, but also expands the documentation to act as a form of resistance. The last thing that came to me when you mentioned this was that Obata, his son Gyo Obata, actually attended Washington University in St. Louis and was an alum of the architecture school. And I didn't really do too much research into the architecture school at all, but I have a feeling that it could be possibly related to the history of the St. Louis School of Fine Arts and Museum. So I think that these histories, especially because the Obata family arrived in St. Louis after World War II, are very connected, even if in possibly indirect ways. Um, so yeah, and before I end about my thesis, there is going to be an exhibit of the Obata works that are on campus in Olin Library, right outside the special collections entryway and by the grand staircase. And that show is starting in late May, so sometime late this month, and I think will be shown throughout September. So if anyone who's listening to this has the chance to go, they should go see the Obata paintings.
Well, that's wonderful. I'm glad we could take a moment to really shine a light on this tremendous work you've done in the context of your thesis as well. And I think the convergence between the projects is really striking, even if it is somewhat indirect and wasn't anticipated in terms of how we came into the work. So as we come to a close in this conversation, I want to maybe invite everyone to share some final thoughts on the value of this internship. This is a new internship, developed through a partnership with the Kemper and CRE2. I can say, as a member of the faculty who's been involved at the Kemper Art Museum and CRE2 separately, it's been great to be part of a project that brings those entities together. And also that, as director of the WashU and Slavery Project, this has been tremendously helpful in terms of learning about this part of our institutional history and the ways that our museum and art school are entangled with legacies of colonialism and slavery, and what we might begin to think about in terms of disentanglement or reckoning with those entanglements. So I'm really appreciative of this work you've done, Gabi. First, I want to invite Sabine and Meredith to share any thoughts you have about the value of this internship. As a new internship, I wonder if it created different kinds of opportunities to connect with students or faculty, and of course with CRE2.
I say, yeah, definitely. I would just want to iterate that I think Gabi really hit it on the nail on the head, I suppose, when she was talking about, the museum is an interdisciplinary space. And I think this internship really was an excellent example of how we can really broaden that and then do it in reality, not just talk about it and making these connections, but working with you, Geoff, it's, through CRE2 and through African and African American studies. I think it's just opened up, Gabi's initial research has already opened up so many interesting avenues that we can move forward with to engage with other faculty on campus. But fundamentally, it's also just an important step, as museums and, higher education have to, think about how to move forward along these anti-racist and decolonized lines. And it's through, I think, this kind of interdisciplinary work that's really going to happen.
Yeah, my hope is very much that we can continue that, because as Gabi pointed out, she, made these initial steps. She came up with a lot of interesting questions rather than yet answers. And so in order to really present this institutional history with all its complex and complicated entanglements with colonialism and racism, I think we need to do a lot of more research. There's a lot of work in front of us, and I think it would profit definitely from input by specifically by historians and people who do sociopolitical research. So at this moment, for me, it's also important, I feel, for the museum to really be maybe a connector for these different humanities researches and give that visibility as well. maybe in the future some kind of program um, uh, could develop out of this initial research internship that is maybe more connected really to classes, to a certificate program in exhibition studies potentially, where we are really not only investigating maybe the history of the collection, but also of how we can fill the gaps we have. And we have huge gaps in terms of not having artworks by African American artists, by indigenous artists, but also by artists who have been overlooked globally. And that goes all the way, I think, we talked about that, Meredith, to the 1960s. So there's a lot of work to be done also in terms of how we can expand the actual collection of artworks that we present in the museum. And so hopefully your initial internship will have a lot of follow-up in different directions. And one, it's certainly very, very important, is to continue what you did in order for us to understand actually the history, the institutional history, the early institutional history of the museum better, and how that connects also to the slavery project, Geoff, you're advancing. But in addition to that, there are many other areas where I can also imagine very important research that leads also to a broader presentation, to a more inclusive presentation of artworks.
And Gabi, we want to ask you how the internship, how you've experienced the internship, and really how maybe to share some perspective on how it's helped to shape your path. And you're graduating in a couple of weeks. Maybe share a bit about what you're doing next, and what you gained from this experience.
Yeah, no, for sure. So there's like three big things that stood out to me. And the first one was my interest in curation. I remember like early on in the internship, in my early meetings with Meredith, I'd be like, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? And like I didn't know, or like, any of the definitions that come with these words that are frequently associated with curation, like provenance, for example. Um, and so I think this internship really helped me expand that interest in curation and understand what it is and what curators do. Um, and it also really helped me like understand, like I said before, the museum world. There was some really wonderful professional development workshops spearheaded by the education department, I believe. And we were able to talk to the different interns, were able to talk to different people at the museum and learn about their different positions. And I think that learning experience was really invaluable. The second thing I'll say is that it expanded my interest in physical archives. Before this internship, I had primarily worked with online archival resources, and most of that was due to the pandemic. I wasn't really able to access in-person archives like was the intended plan. But through this internship, I was able to access in-person archives, and so after talking with the different librarians at Olin and SLAM's archive, it was really helpful learning about what archivists do as well, and their kind of role as I guess object caretakers and artifact caretakers and document caretakers. And so these two kind of interests led to my application process to various Smithsonian institutions, and I was fortunately able to land an internship at the Archives of American Art in Washington, D.C. So I'll be combining both of those interests, archives and art, this summer. And yeah, hopefully that will lead me down the line to just more positions in research and writing, and, collaboration with other people, because that's one of the great things about the Kemper is it's really collaborative, and I think that that's very beautiful. But yeah, that's all I got.
Well, you got a lot, and you've given so much. I want to, just say that it's been, I think I speak for everyone when I say that it's been a tremendous pleasure working with you. I mean, you're just incredibly talented person, and I've learned so much from your work. We all have, and the institution has benefited tremendously for it. So I want to close with some thanks to all of you, first of all, for what I think has been a really rich conversation. And I'm glad we were able to come together. We've had a lot of meetings over the semester, and we've talked about your work, but I'm glad we were able to archive some of that through this podcast. Um, and and so I want to thank all of you. I also want to thank everyone at the Kemper Art Museum who's been involved in supporting this, and everyone at CRE2 for their support of this curatorial research internship. And finally, wish you the very best and offer congratulations to you, Gabi, as you continue at the Archives of American Art this summer and beyond.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.